Thanks, Kathleen, and thank you, everybody, for hosting us tonight. ULI Minnesota actually did one of these workshops for Shoreview. I think it was over 5 years ago, John. You may have been on that panel. It was one of the first ones we had done, and we appreciate the opportunity to get invited back. I'm a recovering city manager. I worked for 36 years for the city of Edina and enjoyed being on some of the same clubs with Terry Schwarm and knowing the secret handshake and whatnot. Being of sound mind, I retired 7 years ago, and I've been doing this with ULI pretty much since then. Well, if you would let me do a bit of a infomercial about ULI. We're a district, ULI Minnesota is a district council of the Urban Land Institute, which is a worldwide nonprofit research and education association supported by its members and sponsors. We have about 40,000 members worldwide, and we were founded back in 1936. Our mission at ULI Minnesota is grounded in developing, nurturing, and expanding relationships to make our region more prosperous and sustainable. How do we accomplish that? It's largely through the Regional Council of Mayors, which ULI has supported since 2004. It started out with a group of 8 mayors, and now we're up to 55 mayors. One of our most loyal members is your mayor, Sandy, co-chaired the Regional Council of Mayors for several years, and we very much consider her a valued member. During the past 5 years, as I mentioned, we've held almost 60 of these workshops to talk about what we call navigating the new normal, changes to our communities brought about by the Great Recession and by demographic preferences, so to speak. But I tell you what, this is the first of these workshops that we've done to an audience like this. All of the other workshops, our audience has been the City Council and the Planning Commission and the HRA and the EDA and whatever appointed boards and commissions the city has. And that's what we did here, I think it was in 2011 with the City Council. So we are going to learn something tonight as to whether this experiment works in terms of having a community conversation with the residents of the community, and I don't see any reason why it won't work. So tonight, what I'm going to do is provide some opening comments, share with you some trends on a national and statewide basis that are affecting cities. And then we're going to turn it over to our panel. We've got some prepared questions for them. It was based upon we call a pregame meeting we had with the staff here a week or two ago, where we learned a bit more about what was going on in the city. I want to say, though, that what we're about tonight is we're not here to tell you what your comprehensive plan ought to be. That's not our mission. That's your job. That's what part of these community conversations are part of the work that the City Planning Commission and City Council and City staff are embarking on. But we hope to share with you some ideas and observations that we hope might be food for thought for developing the comprehensive plan. And we hope perhaps some of our thoughts might be provocative and we can get some discussion going with you. And that's what our hope is tonight. So if I can talk about some trends, and I know that the first workshop that you had was on the topic of demographics, and I'm going to repeat a bit of what some of you may have heard back then, but perhaps I can put a little different spin on it that helps set the stage for the panel discussion that will follow. So we believe our country and region are influenced by 4 major change drivers: demographics, market forces, technology, and the resiliency of our public infrastructure. And we'll take a look at these in a little bit more detail. Demographics, as you probably heard last time, is influenced by the size and characteristics of our different generations, our aging population, and our cultural diversity. Although us boomers continue to dominate Minnesota's population, the millennials, or Gen Y, born between 79 and 85, are catching up and passing the boomers. It's the largest single generation in the U.S. Although they have some distinct differences in their worldviews, they also share some strong opinions about what makes a great community and a great neighborhood. On a statewide basis, we are getting older faster. Between 2010 and 2030, the number of adults age 65 and older is expected to nearly double, while the number of younger residents will increase only modestly. And around 2020, Minnesota's 65-plus population is expected to surpass the K-12 school-age population for the first time, creating some major shifts in virtually all facets of our society. The rapid aging of our population will result in a profound increase in households occupied by us older folks. I count myself among them. Meanwhile, households occupied by those under 65 will remain relatively flat. And a staggering statistic for me is some say that the current supply of single-family homes in our region is adequate to serve our population for the next 20 years. That's because many of us in the boomer category are now moving into different housing types, and most of the region's growth, about 85% of the growth, will be in one and two person households occupied by people 65 or older. Minnesota is becoming increasingly more culturally diverse, and communities are asked to navigate a greater array of cultural needs. And by 2035, about 35% of the Twin Cities population will comprise communities of color. Immigrants are making up an increasing portion of our population, although Minnesota lags behind the United States as a whole. Foreign-born Americans are the most likely ones to start a business. They're about twice as likely than a native-born American to start a business. That makes some community engagement on the part of all cities very important. Minnesota's communities of color lag behind their neighbors in many areas, including poverty rate, home ownership rate, education, as well as housing costs, where 44% are paying more than 30% of their income towards housing. When we look at market forces, a number are shaping our region, most notably the type of housing and neighborhoods preferred by different generations, the impact of housing costs and the mismatch between housing and jobs, and the growing shortage of a trained workforce. Why is this important? In a recent survey conducted by Greater MSP, they asked recent young transplants to the region what they look for in choosing a community to live. Overwhelmingly, the number one attribute was the availability and affordability of housing. All Gen Yers live downtown, right? Not really. Most see themselves as suburbanites and small town folk. Interestingly, though, Gen Y seem to be looking for more urban amenities within the suburbs and small towns they call home. I have an example of that in my house. I have two daughters right in the middle of Gen Y. They're 29 and 31 until recently. One lived on the 18th floor of a 54-story apartment in Wrigleyville in Chicago with her husband. And the other, with her family, lived in a very suburban neighborhood in Woodbury. I asked my Chicago daughter, what do you like best about where you live? And she said, Dad, we're so close to everything. There's biking, walking, we can bike everywhere, we can walk everywhere. Shopping is so close by. We have wonderful parks right by where we live. I asked my daughter in Woodbury what she likes about her neighborhood. She said, Dad, everything's so close by. We can walk, we can bike everywhere. Parks are close by. We have everything we need. So while they live in very different environments, it seems that they are looking for the same attributes of the community and the neighborhood that they live in. Millennials are personally hopeful about their future. The overwhelming majority of Americans today, though, think it will be harder for young people to achieve a secure middle-class lifestyle than it used to be. Things such as saving for retirement, home ownership, the stable, decent-paying job are all having an affordable housing situation are all entering in. We had the annual fishing trip a couple months ago. It's turned into a father-son, grandson kind of event. And us old-timers were shocked when one of the grandsons who graduated from South Dakota State with his wife, I think a year ago, reported having student debt of $190,000 between the two of them. He's a pharmacist, went through a 5-year pharmacy program. She's a teacher. Luckily, they have good jobs, are able to service the debt. But it is certainly delaying some of the attributes of adulthood that I think many of us boomers had, whether it be getting married, starting a family, owning a home. All those things seem to be delayed for that group, and I think in many instances student loan debt plays a big part in it. Widening income gap, the income gap between America's highest earners and the rest of the population has grown and continues to grow. The number of cost-burdened households, those that are paying more than 30% of their income, has grown to comprise almost 1/2 of all households in the metro area, many of whom are living below the poverty level. Most are working. About 69% of the households living in poverty have one or more working members. Minnesota and the metropolitan area have fared better than many other parts of the country in rebounding from the Great Recession. However, a large portion of the job growth in the region has been at wages that struggle to meet housing needs in the areas where those jobs are located. And there seems to be a growing mismatch between where lower wage workers are employed and where they can find housing that they can afford. And over the next few years, regional businesses may struggle to find talented and qualified employees. This really came home to us a couple of weeks ago. ULI hosted its annual housing summit, and we had officials from Amazon and Shutterfly on our panel who reported to us that the plans for expansion, plans for location in the metro area are seriously affected by the availability of workforce housing in relatively close proximity to their jobs. So housing is certainly an element of economic development, I think, for all cities. E-commerce has changed the face of retailing, not just in Minnesota, but nationwide, where it accounts for $1.2 trillion of total retail market and is growing about 15% annually since the Great Recession. And as a result, the construction of new retail space has dropped precipitously during and after the recession and has not recovered to pre-recession levels. And I suspect some of our panelists will be able to talk a little bit about that. New and developing technologies affect all of us. Automation may be the flip side of the shortage of qualified workforce. It's been suggested that up to 47% of American jobs may be automated over the next couple decades. If that may have the effect of freeing up workers to do more intensive and creative work at their jobs, but it may result in factory-type employers not being able to offer the same sort of wages that they did in decades past. Technology is enabling new kinds of service. For those boomers in the audience like me, you won't find Ben Franklin or Woolworths on it, as hard as you might look. These are the logos of many of the new companies that now all of us are doing business with, and I think the next generation in particular is very tuned into this and tends to believe that providing access to goods or services is becoming perhaps more important than outright ownership. Some technologies will affect us in so many ways, such as driverless cars, 3D printing, drone delivery. Autonomous vehicles or driverless cars could dramatically shift how we get people around, how many cars we own, parking design for cities. Some say it'll be here in 5 years, some say it'll be 25 years. A message we have, though, that even the most pessimistic forecast of say, 25 years is a shorter life than the infrastructure decisions that the city is making today, whether it be parking facilities, street design, street widths, you name it. Those things have a longer life, and we are encouraging all cities to think about that when you're designing streets, when you're designing public spaces, as to what the effect of driverless cars might be. I read in the paper the other day, City of Bloomington is now considering standards on parking ramps, new parking ramps that require that they build so they could be adapted to a different use in the future, meaning less sloping drive ramps and the like, in order to allow them to be converted to a use other than parking in the future. We're also at the beginning of the Internet of Things, a state of widespread connectivity between people, structures, and gadgets. These things are monitoring all sorts of things. They're getting smaller and cheaper, and we seem to be putting them on everything, which has many consequences to all of us at the city level who are responsible for overseeing the basic infrastructure of our community. Resiliency in all forms has become important for all our communities. Changing technology and growing interconnectedness of all things mean that more parts of our built environment will be at risk of being compromised. I don't think that the water problem at the city of Blaine a few months ago was related to a cyber attack or anything like that, but it shows the vulnerability of public infrastructure. When I started at Edina in 1974, you turned on the water with a big pipe wrench and turned it off. Not anymore. It's a whole different situation that creates more and more vulnerabilities. Size and specs of warehouse facilities have grown substantially to accommodate distribution centers. Again, it used to be 24-foot ceiling heights were state-of-the-art. Now 36-foot are being demanded in so many locations. And as the needs of these industrial and warehouse facilities have changed, many cities are left with outdated buildings with unclear futures. Instead of simply hoping for redevelopment, some communities have embraced new ways to use these older structures, such as maker spaces, which are a collaborative workspace where people can learn new skills and put them to productive use without the attendant costs of a new facility. Aging infrastructure has been costly to cities, hard to keep up. I don't need to tell the city staff here about what it costs to maintain these systems and the difficulty in finding sources of revenue to pay for them. Things like rainfall events, how many of us are getting sick of the 100-year storm that happens every 5 or 6 years, it seems, and these things are all contributing to the challenge that all of us in the cities have to deal with. We have a number of guiding principles at ULI. I think it's on a handout that was on the table when you arrived, and I won't go through these one by one, but I think it shares some of the thoughts we have about what makes successful communities and the types of things that perhaps you should think about as you craft the comprehensive plan. With that, I would like to shift gears to our panel discussion. Yes?
Is it okay to ask a question?
Please do.
I'm curious how you were mentioning over Minnesota broadly and possibly the metro area, Shoreview individually. I'm curious how some of these things may differ, like some of the statistics you have, and especially given that we live in one of the greatest school districts in the state of Minnesota, and how that drives who is trying to live here and what demographics would be interested in finding houses, and do we actually have that overcapacity of homes that the rest of the state may be looking at?
Question was, if I can paraphrase, this map is pretty broad in nature. How does it boil down to a Shoreview that maybe has some very unique characteristics, such as the Mounds View School District is a wonderful school district, and other aspects, housing values in the community and the like. I have to tell you that a part of our normal workshop, part 2 of our normal workshop, is exactly what you're asking for, which is a drill down into local demographics. We elected not to do that tonight since you had just had a demographic workshop. So we can help by providing you some data relative to Shoreview. I don't have it on hand tonight just because we did not want to double up on it. But you raise a good point, and I think some people on the panel perhaps are able to drill down a bit into some of the things that is unique about Shoreview. It's just a beautiful community. It's a wonderful values. It's got a great community center, got great demographics, a great school system, got so many great things going about it. But we think you should be aware that there's some general trends at work that in our view affect all cities, Shoreview included, and things you should keep your eye on when you craft this comprehensive plan. They may affect other cities more profoundly than Shoreview, but there's some effect here as well. Before we get started with the panel, what I would like to do is have them provide a brief infomercial about who they are and who they represent, and then we'll get into some of the panel discussion. And something I'd like to stress is we have found that the value of these workshops have been in interaction with the audience. So while we have some prepared questions for the panel, I would urge you to jump in if you have a question or observation that you'd like the panel to comment on. So with that, John, and we have to hand the mic tonight if you can start it up.
I'm John Breidinger. I've been doing mostly redevelopment of workouts of problem properties for the last 36 years. And with Cushman Wakefield Northmark, I head up our real estate development advisory practice, which is usually just that. And I'd like to come back to that question because I think it's a great one. And so we'll talk about that some more.
Hi, my name's Heidi Zimmer, and I think you have our backgrounds. I've been developing real estate for 20 years now, mostly affordable housing, mixed income projects, every kind of both historic rehab, new construction kind of projects you can think of here in the Twin Cities. And I'm now with Art Space, and we build creative spaces for artists all over the United States. So I work in places as diverse as East Harlem, New York City, and Fergus Falls, Minnesota, and just about everywhere between. And what I love about my job is that it allows me to collect great ideas for what make great communities and great cities all across the country. So I'm excited to be here tonight. Thank you for having us.
Good evening, I'm Catherine Gannenbrink. I'm a relatively recent transplant to the Twin Cities region from after 16 years living and working as a real estate developer in New York City. And so I'm at heart an urbanist, and I really love a lot of things about walkable lifestyle. And I think I grew up actually in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and so I've had some experience growing up in all the wonderful assets that suburbs have. And so I'm really interested in this question of like how, as the country continues to urbanize in some ways, what do the suburbs become? And I think that's going to be a lot of our discussion tonight, which I'm really excited about.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. My name is Jason Arswald with a company called Ehlers & Associates, and what we do is we're an advisory firm. We help cities do things like economic development, redevelopment. We help with the financing of those projects. You might have heard of tax increment financing. We work a lot with that. We also work on long-term financial planning and bond sales, those sorts of things that help communities achieve some of their development and infrastructure goals. Prior to that, I worked for about 16 to 17 years for cities, primarily doing economic development and community development. So that's really kind of where my passion lies, is working to bring cities, a lot of suburban communities, and helping them kind of realize some of their redevelopment objectives that they have that are out there. So happy to be with you tonight.
Okay, thank you, everybody. You know, I think we'll start with you then, John, since you were kind enough to tee up a question for John. How do you see that Shoreview fits into the metro market? What's possible here? I'm thinking retail, restaurants, other types of uses like that, given the makeup of the community.
That's more than one question, but I think that what I would say is the question you asked is probably the most important question that I can think of as a community begins the comprehensive planning process that's going to guide development going forward. You know, there are trends that affect every single one of us, and we have to pay attention to them. They're driving a tremendous amount of change, and change is interesting because on one hand, it's creating tremendous opportunity. There's demand for products that don't exist. The way we use the real estate products that we have is changing. And then there's the other side of change where it's creating obsolescence and dislocation. But I think that the single most important thing that any community can do is really think about and be clear and articulate about what the assets of the community are. Shoreview is a very healthy place by every measure. You know, it's a fully developed place. It's interesting, I used Waze today to navigate the traffic and brought me through the neighborhoods. I mean, this is a beautiful, green, leafy place. And, you know, the trend of urbanization is true, and it's also true that many people want to live in places that have more space, that have access to nature and water. And I think that, you know, the question, if you pointed specifically to the school district, has a great deal to do with why people choose to live here and why this is such a strong residential community. You know, one thing to pay attention to is what happens as the population ages. And many people, you know, who've grown up and raised their families and lived in this community and love this community want to stay here, but no longer have children in school. You know, all of those things are really important to pay attention to. You know, where I see Shoreview fitting within the metropolitan area, I don't see this being a place that's going to be a fundamentally when we think of urban density, we think of central cities. You know, I think that there's opportunity for a little bit more density, but I think that the things that people have valued here in the past are the things that they're going to value. So the question is, how in this community accommodate changing preferences for housing. A lot of that will be regeneration and redevelopment of existing housing stock, and maybe there will be opportunities to build some others. The question that comes up in every community is, you know, how do we get, usually the first question is, how do we get a Trader Joe's? That one's off the table, because we've got that. And that actually says a lot about a community, and that's I'm not kidding when I say that's usually the very first question that's asked of me as a commercial developer. So that says something about the character of this place, that there's a sufficient density. I pulled up what we call a retail marketplace profile that's sort of, you know, 26,000 people living in Shoreview, and we look at the aggregate demand for retail goods and services that are generated within the city. It's $583 million of almost $584 million of retail demand is generated in the city limits. only about 170 million of that is actually captured here in the city. So what that tells me is that you need to, from a retail standpoint, take a slightly bigger look at your community. All of that money is being spent most likely close to home. You sort of, this is not an underserved market. The Rosedale and Maplewood regional trade areas are both close by. Both are very healthy and have terrific offerings. And there's pretty good retail around. I don't see much opportunity within Shoreview to develop more retail. You just don't have the sites for it situated on these streets. There may be some regeneration and reuse of existing facilities. Restaurants, that's usually the second thing people want to know about is that, why don't we have great dining here? Restaurants like to cluster together. We're seeing some trends toward destination chef-driven, more locally oriented restaurants. I wouldn't say that it can't happen, but I don't see that as a big opportunity for this community. I think one thing that will provide a very interesting opportunity is the redevelopment of the TCAP site next door, and your community sort of wraps around it. And I think that maybe the healthiest way to think about the kinds of new retail that you might like to attract is to think of that as sort of an extension of this community. Yeah.
You used a term that I didn't understand, CCAP.
TCAP, what's that stand for? Yeah, it's this big site, just the arsenal. Yeah. Yes.
With regard to retail, things that we're planning out for 2040, when I got out of high school, or getting out of high school, Target opened up its first store in Roseville. You might say first of these big box wholesalers or low cost retailers. And we've watched different iterations of this come from, Kmart, Walmart, when they all eat up one another. Now we have Amazon, which is destroying some of the big box retailers. So a good question is, in 20 years, how do you plan to retail?
John, can you repeat, kind of paraphrase?
Yeah, so I'm going to take a liberty.
What's it going to be?
Stop me if I don't capture the essence of what you want to know. But the question is one that we're all asking ourselves, and that is really, what is the future of retail given the profound change that technology is bringing and the impact of e-commerce? And the answer is, I don't know. I can tell you that I've had a 36-year career that has not solely, but mostly been centered around retail space. And I'm now completing the regeneration of 2 shopping centers. I've been working on both of them. And they're both one's in a community very much like this. It was an existing project, and the other is in Rochester. I don't have another one in my pipeline. It's become, everything I'm looking at now, the footprint of retail is definitely shrinking. And everything I'm looking at now is adapting and reusing these sites. And in some cases, we're actually tearing down shopping center space and building multifamily next to it. If you think of what's happening, if you're familiar with the Southdale Regional Mall area, I don't know what the number of units, you may know, but it's, thousands maybe. I'm going to guess 2,000 units of housing have been developed in and around what was a fully developed regional trade area. And it's interesting, if somebody had said, well, somebody did say that's what was going to happen, who the heck would want to live here? But it's really interesting how it's changing the character of that place, and it's not slowing down. I remember when we started seeing, I now live in downtown Minneapolis, never thought I would. I remember when we started building along the river, I was thinking, train tracks, who's ever gonna wanna live here? So I think that's part of the answer is, those are some places where senior housing, medical office, live, work kinds of environments are gonna happen. I think there are 4 reasons why stores aren't gonna go away. One is that, and I'm certain that if we went around this room and talked to people about, what they would like in their community, a certain amount of shopping would be high on the list. The convenience shopping is kind of a quality of life thing that everybody really wants. I mean, there's a reason why the Trader Joe's question is always the first question that comes up. The second is that there's an element of service that's pretty hard to deliver through a UPS truck or over the wire that is still best delivered in a physical environment. I think of buying a bicycle. It's not hard to buy a bike on the internet, but and the whole process of buying one is completely different. 20 years ago, I would walk into a specialty store, talk to somebody about my age, interested in what I'm interested in, and the whole process from start to finish would happen there. Now, I'm doing a little bit of Googling and, finding people like me and, reading reviews. And so now I walk into but I still need somebody to put the damn thing together, to fit it to me, to accessorize it. I'm pretty handy, but that's still something I want. And so I still try to buy it, locally, but it's a different process because now I walk in with a list of questions, probably a price in mind, and much more informed. The third thing is that product designers and manufacturers benefit from the ability to curate an experience. And the best retail, the things that people enjoy the most are, there's still something great about a great retail experience, and there are many, many examples, and there's still a lot of innovation in this space. And then the last thing that I see is that as more and more of us are living in 1- and 2-person households and spending more time online, being more isolated, having gathering places in our communities. I mean, there's a reason why so many coffee shops are being built, and so I don't think retail is going away. I think the footprint is shrinking. I think the way we use it is going to change. I don't know about the big box retailers, but I if there's a particular vulnerability, it seems to me that might be where it is, because most of by definition, that's a stock-up trip. That's not something you need every day, and so it's pretty easy to get it delivered. So I hope that gives you some answer. I think we're going to continue to see a lot of change.
Heidi and Catherine, you both have, I think, some experience about the notion of reusing some of these spaces. Is that accurate? Can you comment on that?
Sure, although I haven't cracked the code yet on how to put housing inside of a vacant Kmart building. I have been asked, trust me. And we do a lot of consulting on community theaters and those kinds of things. And with the whole, there's a crisis in the church congregations and synagogues and decreased participation in those facilities and reuse of those spaces as well. It's not certainly happening here, but there's a lot of places in the country where school districts are shrinking, and there's a lot of school buildings that need to be adapted and reused. And it's, John, for me, what I've seen is John really hit the nail on the head talking about the gathering spaces. As people are, I'm hoping to see that we're in an arc with all this technology, and people are finally maybe starting to realize that looking at your phone and iPad and laptop all day is actually harming your quality of life. and they really do need to get out, and, go somewhere, community theater. I just saw the yoga class starting as I was walking in. Activities and events and things that bring people together for conversation, for music, for gameplay, those kinds of activities, like your beautiful community center here, is what we're seeing around the country as some of those big empty boxes and spaces being adapted and used for. I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I would just in short kind of echo the value of experience. I think, especially when you look at the upcoming millennial generation, they're really putting a lot of value on experience over consumption. So I think that retail is probably going to follow suit, which is some of what both of you have been saying, right? It's not necessarily a place to go buy something, it's a place to go explore, whether it's a brand or a new product type, test things out, and meet other people that are interested in the same sort of thing you're interested in. And it's not just transactional anymore. It's a hub, it's an experience that can't be replicated through the computer.
Yeah, maybe just one last thing to that, and that is that what we're seeing in the retail world is a huge disparity between the haves and the have-nots. So there are places people want to be, and there are places that people don't want to be. And the performance of those shopping centers, the occupancy, the rents they can generate are hugely different. The best shopping centers in Rosedale is still doing great, and the rents there are great. I think you want to watch the neighborhood and community centers. The big boxes, to me, are among the most vulnerable because of the very fact there is no experience there. I mean, there's no particularly, I shouldn't say not, I mean, some of those merchants are good, but if it's not more compelling to go there and buy your stuff than it is to, push a button on Amazon, I think they're very vulnerable.
ULI convened a panel on a national basis a few months ago. I think it echoed what you're talking about, Catherine. One of the comments were the next generation tends to be drawn to environments where there are a lot of opportunities to bump into other people, whether it's a coffee shop, place, or a sofa store, or a church. It's opportunities to bump into other people seems to be something that's happening in our environment right now. Catherine, I'm going to turn to you. I talked a bit in my presentation, and we're talking about it now, about Gen Y and the boomers. It seems in large measure they almost are looking for the same thing. Can you talk about what those are, and what could Shoreview do to enhance attractiveness to both the boomers and the next generation?
Sure. Well, the first thing that I think about is really the trends that are going to impact housing and the housing stuff. And I think there are some things that dovetail really nicely between the needs of the younger and the older generation, and that's the trend of multi-generational housing. And so there are a lot of stats that have come out. I don't have it at my fingertips, but this is a high growth area. This idea that we should be living in multi-generations has been popular in many cultures and places over time, but it's growing across the country. And I think one classic example of that, so baby boomers are retiring healthier than prior generations when they retire, so they're more active. At the same time, younger generations deferring having children until later in life. And so what ends up happening, which is what happened fortunately for me, is grandparent care has become a pretty major trend as well, right? So the grandparents have retired, they have the time and the energy and the health, and at the same time, dual working parents have childcare needs. Childcare is hard to come by in a lot of communities and also very expensive in a lot of communities. And So it's a real nice way of those two kind of things matching up. But then how do you facilitate that from a built environment point of view? Do you live in the same place? And do you necessarily all want to live in the same house that you grew up in, or is there a different way of living? And so there are things like accessory dwelling units that have become more popular in certain places where they can, it's kind of, I think of them as kind of the modern version of having a carriage house in the back, or a guest cottage or something. And so you can actually have a kind of smaller, it's not just about the apartment or the garage anymore, it's something a little more than that and a little more complete. And also at the same time, I think there's a growing interest in cooperative living. Maybe this is a different ownership structure. People band together in some sort of cooperative group and then sort of live in a more communal way with the people that participate in that cooperative. And so then maybe it's not just your personal nuclear family and your extended family, but it's a set of families that have come together in a multi-generational way, committed to a way of kind of making their own village wherever they live. And so all of these things kind of impact housing and the type of housing people might be interested in looking for. Sometimes maybe it's about a little added density, but other times it might just be a way of reconfiguring what you already have and thinking about that. I think also, a major trend that ULI talks about a lot with the younger generation is, wanting to be able to walk, not being car dependent, etc. And that's, again, something that dovetails nicely with the older generation as well, when maybe driving becomes difficult. And so thinking about ways in which people can live closer to the amenities, such as the wonderful one we're in right now, or a grocery store, might also cause us to rethink how we maybe do some infill redevelopment of residential housing. The second thing I think that is really critical is a sense of place, and I know some of the other panelists have done a lot of work in this area. But I think a sense of place is really also growing importance. It's a little bit of what we were just talking about with the retail question. The sense that there's a there. I think that's important for communities to think about as they're doing their comprehensive planning. More and more people want to identify with the place that they live and have a real sense of where you are. And it's not just a stop or an exit off the highway, it's a real place with a real heart and a soul. And what does that mean? And to try and keep that in mind as you're thinking through this process. And I think it also can overlay with some other important parts of developing your community going forward, and that's in the areas of sustainability and wellness. I think, for example, you can try and make this a little more concrete. Water storm issues are a huge thing in Minnesota right now. And there are kind of two approaches you can take. You can take what we call the gray infrastructural approach, right? Let's make our stormwater retention tanks really big, these big concrete bunkers, and put them underground, and make our sewer pipes bigger, and it's a major public investment and very expensive. And then there's what we call green infrastructure, which is, well, let's look at all the impervious surfaces we have, like parking lots or roofs and things like this that amplify the effect of these storms, and let's try and figure out ways to make them soft, make them greener. So this could be rethinking the way you do sidewalks and sort of building these little, essentially green marsh pits between the tree pits along the sidewalk or something along those lines. And what's great about green infrastructure is not only it's a little more flexible, it's lower cost, but it also adds to the curb appeal of your community. So now instead of spending all this money on something underground that's really expensive and you don't get to see and enjoy, we now have something right here on the surface that also improves your sense of place. So thinking about ways where you can both tackle these bigger issues about infrastructure and things like that, but also add to the value of the experience of place. I think that's important. And the towns that do invest that way and think that way are going to be, I think, more attractive. And then finally, I was just going to say, I think really embracing the reality that you kind of brought out in your question about retail, that massive change is always coming. And I think it's just the start of it. We're gonna have this disruptive, sort of technological revolution that's gonna be ongoing for a while. And I think we need to accept that that's happening, and it's changing, it's gonna change the way our built environment can function. And the communities that are ready and excited and embracing that they need to be flexible in the face of this oncoming technological change, I think are gonna really position themselves well to attract and retain residents. And also to accommodate the aging population requires a lot of flexibility and openness to changing the way we've done things in the past. So like an example of that would be the self-driving cars that you referenced earlier, electric car infrastructure, being ready for things like that, the changing nature of work. Maybe people are going to be able to increasingly work from anywhere, so maybe it would make sense to adapt and create co-working spaces that are municipal co-working spaces rather than waiting for a private company to decide it's time to put one in your community. And so I think just that openness and flexibility to understanding that there are massive disruptive changes coming our way is critical when you think about these long-term planning exercises.
Go ahead, Dennis.
Oh,
Question?
and the changes of, like you specifically talked, the increasing senior population of Shoreview, do you see public transportation in that mix?
Yeah, so, yes. The question was about the aging population here in Shoreview and public transportation. I think that's critical to think about mobility for people of all ages and all abilities. And so for me personally, I am a huge believer in mass transit, not only as a vehicle to get somebody from point A to point B, but also as the commons. It's a place where we could engage with others in our community. And so I think we're not really seeing yet mass transit, that side of mass transit, right? It could be not just a vehicle from A to B, it's also like an opportunity, a platform, another place where we're meeting with other people. And so I think that there is a really important place for that. I unfortunately don't know in enough detail kind of where Shoreview, in terms of, to speak specifically to specific, bus routes and things like that.
That was addressed a few years ago and they did nothing about it.
Yeah, I think that mass transit for both the younger generation that wants to not be in their cars and the older generation that may not have the option of being in their cars is an important investment in the future of the municipality. And I think there are also new ways of thinking and shaping and intersecting public transit and technology that should make it more appealing to even more people. So for example, one of the things about waiting for a bus that's unpleasant is not knowing when the bus is going to come. Well, we have the technology now, and it's still, not perfect yet, but obviously as that improves over time, the sort of predictability and reliability of understanding schedule reduces the inconvenience of not, having your vehicle at the ready the second you need it.
Shoreview did have something once upon a time, and I don't know why they dropped it. It was called the Roseville Circulator, and it would get people from Shoreview into Roseville, being able to connect to mass transit systems instead of me taking a bus from Shoreview to Target in Shoreview via downtown St. Paul for 2.5 hours, one way.
Right.
And so why that ended, just when I needed it, I don't know. I could drive for 1.5 years, and anybody's married to a guy that doesn't like to shop knows where I'm going. It was really hard, and I was hoping that something would get done, and it never did.
Yeah, and I think it's important to revisit too, right? Because the demographics are changing over time, and something that didn't work 10 years ago might work now.
That's definitely the kind of feedback.
Well, this was something we talked about over the Kozak ordeal, and it went here.
Well, I can't answer for why it went down, but I would, encourage any community that you do have. I think we looked at the demographics, so there is a bit of there's an aging issue in this community, and so any community that's got its biggest cohort in baby boomers and up population, mass transportation and public transportation of all kinds is going to be a really important thing to think about in this next 5-year planning process.
And one little thing I wanted to add to that too is not just thinking about the mass transit options that we have today, and also thinking about biking. And I know a lot of people think, well, biking, is for people that are really, fit and have all of this. But with the new electric bikes, I think biking, the age range of people that can safely bike is expanding because these are electric assist bikes. So really the same level of fitness to get from point A to point B is not necessarily going to be needed in the future. So if the bike infrastructure is there for people to safely be able to do that, then that's another option.
I think two things. The aging population of Shoreview is probably directly correlated to the number of senior housing buildings that they have put up in the past 10 years. And also, you might want to rethink biking when the aging population visually cannot keep up with some of the things that we think that they can, just because we haven't gotten there yet.
Let me speak to that. I have a Medicare card, so I won't say exactly how old I am, but I have a Medicare card. I work part-time occasionally at the U of M, and I park my bike at the depot in Hopkins, or my car, and I bike the 12 miles to the U and back, even at my age and less than absolute, perfect condition. So if I can do it, you can do it, and I think more and more of us are going to be doing it.
I'm talking about my mother at age 2, cataracts and,
Right. Well, I got one too, It just made me think I'm multi-generational. Was at my wife's grandmother's funeral today at 101, who had not only grandchildren, great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren, but one great-great-great-grandchild. So they weren't all living together, but I think it shows as longevity occurs, we're going to have more of these types of housing. I'm going to turn it back to John for a second here.
I think that this whole mobility thing is one of the most important infrastructure questions that we have, and I think there are a bunch of really interesting opportunities. We need to start to think of transportation as a system, and it may very well be that in a community of the density of Shoreview, it's pretty difficult to have cost-effective mass transit, but the bike may make that link to, you're not very far from the I-35 corridor, not very far from Roseville. And there are many other things coming. The ride sharing. I just spent a couple of days in Appleton, Wisconsin. There's no less transit-friendly place on earth. And it's not a pedestrian place. I used Uber, and it was cheaper than renting a car. Actually, I used Lyft. But it is, I think, with some of the new technology, driverless cars and car sharing and other transportation options, there may be ways to link into a bigger system. And we have to start to think of it as a system. We treat our roads and bridges like they're free, and we don't charge ourselves anything for them. And buses and trains are expensive. And, I don't know if that's taken us in the right direction, but I think technology may have something to offer in some of these solutions.
I was smiling, Catherine, when you mentioned, the future of communities and how they're living, because it actually, what you were saying reminded me of my neighborhood right now, and a lot of us are here. And as far as, helping each other out with childcare and having that sense of community and some of those things. And then also that we are very dense in population right now. I mean, we're basically full, and there are only 250 acres of land right now in Shoreview that isn't already developed. And a lot of it is swamp or marshland. I'm not sure exactly what the term for it is. But given that, and some of these ideas that you're proposing are things that we need to bring to Shoreview, where is that going to happen? Because these neighborhoods are full, and I know that today isn't necessarily a day that you wanted to speak about specific pockets of neighborhoods, but I have to ask the question, you know, what's going to happen to our neighborhoods? What if we don't want them redeveloped? What if we have that sense of community already? Obviously, we will grow, we will change, we will continue, but where is that going to happen? Are we going to take away some of the thriving areas in order to do so, just to get that walkability if you happen to live within the central corridor? And part of the reason I asked that, and part of the reason I'm here today is I have a 14-page document from the Hoisington Kedler group that talks about the redevelopment of my neighborhood, where I live with my family and my neighbors who support my family. It's really distressing to hear some of these things and being told that these changes need to happen when it could be over my plot of land. So I know that that's not your goal today as a panel, and this is not a question necessarily for you to answer, but it's really distressing, and that's why I'm here.
Well, I don't know how to rephrase the question exactly, but I think it's really a question of not being excited about change and not really wanting to embrace a change to your particular neighborhood. I look at a community.
I wouldn't say not excited about change. I would say more, given who we are as a community, where will change happen? How do we make that happen in a fully developed community? How do we incorporate these changes?
So one of Gordon's questions that he hasn't asked is, what distinguishes successful communities from unsuccessful communities? And I think it starts in rooms like this. It starts with neighborhoods that are strong enough, that have people who care enough to come out and ask hard questions and start to think about how these things impact neighborhoods. I look at St. Louis Park as a model community for having really navigated a tremendous amount of change over a long period of time, and not really fundamentally changing in character, but having very active programs to help people reinvest and actively. I mean, the housing stock here, much of it is at an age where it almost certainly has been regenerated in some way, and if it hasn't, it will be going forward. And so I think it's really up to communities and to neighbors and the people who live here to engage in really deciding what's going to happen. It's not up to me, as a developer, I have so little faith in the ability of developers to socially engineer anything. I mean, if we're successful at all, it's in identifying gaps between what exists and what the people in the community want, and then trying to help find solutions. But that's really what leadership is all about, is starting to ask those questions, bringing people in with diverse perspectives, take it in or don't. But I think it's a great question, and I think it's very, very important to recognize that change is coming, and there are two sides to it, and communities that lean into it and actively participate in how it affects them are the ones that prosper.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and then also to say I'm just really excited that you're here, because I think a lot of times young families aren't able to be active voices because you're raising young children and you're really busy, and it's a crunch on time. And I think what's critical for this process, and why I was really impressed that Shoreview had like set up these public meetings prior to engaging the comprehensive planning process. There are a lot of communities that don't do that. They just shortcut it and like, okay, the planners will put out the document and then, you know, you might have a comment period that's over. I mean, that's amazing. And I think as much as you can encourage your community, your micro community, right, the people that are right around you to participate as much as they're able, the better, because then all of the voices of the community are going to be heard that way, and that's where you end up with the best outcome at the end of the day. And as a developer, I don't like having an antagonistic relationship with the community that I'm building in either, because it's not productive for me either. Like I'm a pretty idealistic person by nature, so I'm always looking to try and do something that's going to make everything better. And so I think that dialogue is such a critical piece of it. So just thanks for being here.
So the back, I'm going to ask way in the back.
Okay, sorry. So you said change is coming. What are the changes? What's on the 14-page document? Where is that available? I'm sorry that I don't know these things, but is there anyone else who doesn't know these things? Okay.
Folks, let me try to respond to that. Neither I nor any of the panelists know anything about a 14-page document, don't know anything about what the Washington Coldware might be doing. And frankly, that's not our focus tonight. What we want to share with you are what are some of the macro trends that are happening throughout the country that you would be wise to think about as you craft the comprehensive plan. And we're not talking about a one-size-fits-all. You know, every community is different, every neighborhood is different. And those are the challenges that you all have as you go forward and craft this comprehensive plan. But our bottom line is change is coming, be aware of it. It'll affect you in some ways. When I was in Edina in about 1980, we approved the subdivision of one of the last remaining tracts of land in the city. And I was city planner at the time, and I remember our finance director coming in and in all seriousness saying, well, now we can get rid of the planning department since we have now platted all of the land remaining in the city. Yet in the last 35 years, that city has gone through incredible changes that have affected all of its neighborhoods, from McMansions, from tear downs to every other kind of phenomenon that housing that's occurring where Southdale is, and adjoining properties. And even with a fully developed city, and even if you have relatively little land left for development, I think you're still going to be faced with some significant drivers that are going to affect all neighborhoods in the city. But you have to craft your own plan. We're not here to craft the plan. We're not here to pass judgment on it. We're just here to share some thoughts and trends that seem to be happening throughout the country and the metro area. I'm going to go later.
And I was going to take off on Mr. Reidinger's comment about transportation being like a wheel with many spokes. It's a complete system. Looking at Shoreview, I think we could safely say light rail isn't going to be part of it here. We're probably looking at some thing of cars, trucks, buses, bikes. And looking at the marketplace, there's more and more electric cars. Minnesota relies to a great extent on the gasoline tax to fund this roadway system that we have. That money is not going to be there as this trend of electrification continues. And also, where I'm going is how do we pay for this? We're going to probably more driverless vehicles. Localities in the state tax for the sale of vehicles and title fees. So how are you gonna pay for all of this? What are your ideas about looking into the future there? Because nobody likes to pay taxes. And I'll give you one caveat. I had 39 years in the state of Minnesota Vehicle Services Division. My last job was chasing down auto thieves and tax cheats. I found a lot of both. So when you look at your crystal balls, how do you pay for it?
It sounds like we should be asking you that question.
Well, I'm aware of how the state divides up funds. And they call it property tax relief, but technically it's never worked out that way. And it's distributed statewide on the interstate truck highway systems, county state aid highways, municipal state aid roads, and then property tax for the local roads. A city like Shoreview can't pay by using property tax all of the transit needs or transportation needs of the city. We're going to depend on, in this given environment, on the state. God help us. When you look forward with less gas tax revenue, and remember we're getting more economic vehicles anyway for the remaining gas, where do you see it going? How do you pay for it?
So it's a big question. Obviously, the question is, how with all the stuff that needs to happen, all the infrastructure, transportation, how are we going to pay for all of this? And it's a good question. I think the short answer is it's going to be from a little bit of everywhere. I think that's the only way. You end up having to piece this stuff together. And we work in a lot of communities where the local government is struggling with wanting projects to get built that had historically really been the responsibility of state government or the federal government. Interchanges are a great example of that. Right now, if you want a new interchange in your community, you better be ready to find a local source of money and pony up to get it built, or it's probably not going to happen. And so we work with a lot of places that are trying to figure out, well, okay, how are we going to get our local contribution into this project? And it's coming from local property taxes, it's coming from things like tax increment financing, it's coming from development fees on developers that are building in these areas, it's coming from all of those places. That's one way that's happening. You've got, light rail investment that's happening, as you noted, not here, but in other places. Along with that, there's a huge local share that's coming into play for local betterments and things of that nature. Again, communities are trying to figure out how are we going to pay for all of that, and it's the same kind of thing. And I suspect that, I don't work at the state level or the federal level in terms of how these funding decisions are going to get made, but, in general, I think the trend is it's being pushed more to the locals, right? And they're going to be tasked with how to solve it. And the tools at the local level and the toolbox is not anywhere near as big as it is at the state and federal level. So I don't have a great answer. I know it's going to continue to be a huge challenge. Cities are wrestling with it every single day. And, the money's going to have to come from a lot of different sources. I don't know if anybody else.
I just add one thing. First of all, it all comes from us, right?
One way or the other.
It comes from us. And Terry, I don't know where it stands during my reign of Terry at Edina, we worked hard on something called the transportation utility, which was addressing one of the things you're talking about is how can you raise dollars locally to pay for transportation infrastructure, because you can't specially assess it anymore. Gas tax funds are down and shrinking, and the concept was getting authority to create a transportation utility just like a sewer utility and a water utility in order to spread that burden over a broader base of taxpayers than just those driving gasoline-powered cars. I don't know if that's ever gone anywhere. No, so it hasn't gone anywhere.
It's shut down.
It's continually shut down, but I think that in my opinion, the innovation for paying for these systems is going to come from the local level of government, not from the federal level of government. So it's one more challenge that's on the plate of Terry and his cohorts in other cities is how do you create that local wherewithal to pay for transportation infrastructure that's not coming from elsewhere. Transportation utility is just one idea that way. Sir?
That's when I first made a comment on transportation, it might have been John who mentioned it, but that hub and spoke idea, I thought there really might be something there. The way our density is, we're not gonna have transportation come here or anything like that, but be able to take like Uber, Lyft, rideshare. The other day I went from an airport to a hotel 15 miles away for $4.50. If you can use that to get to a hub, whether it's a bus hub or a light rail hub, you can get to, you know, many different places. So something more along that lines might be an idea for this type of community that's never had.
Yeah, integrating different modes of transportation.
It's interesting, the market is already starting to respond to that. I'm helping a 1,400 person company build a new headquarters in downtown Minneapolis, and we're looking at, just in the last 30 days, we've really been studying how people get to work, because we're dealing with taking away surface parking lots that are very cheap today, and we're going to replace them with a more expensive resource. And what we're finding is that that employee population is coming from all 4 points on the compass. Many of them are coming from lower density, further out places that are just not served by transit. But it's really interesting, almost 60% of the employee population there is using some form of alternative transportation, something other than a single occupancy car. And it ranges from carpooling to, actually, there's a significant population that bikes. It is kind of a seasonal thing. But I think this is another place where technology may really help us out. When I got into my Lyft last night to go from my hotel to where I was having dinner, the guy asked me, do you mind stopping and picking somebody else up? And I said, no. And, it was interesting. So the cost of my ride was half of what it might have been, and I wouldn't have been smart enough to figure that out. So I think there are some solutions coming. An awful lot of it is going to be harvesting waste from the street, all those empty seats in vehicles, just like the hotel industry is having to deal with all those empty beds.
Johnny,
For aging population that can't get to something like that, they don't have to drive.
I'm sorry?
For an aging population that won't be able to drive, using something like that to get someplace, whether it's a hub or a shopping center, that might be a good alternative.
Well, and I also think this is another great argument for strong neighborhoods and strong communities, because I think to a large degree, people end up helping each other out and shopping together and doing other things.
You made the comment before, Henry Ford.
Well, Steve Jobs, talked a lot about innovation, and his favorite quote was that if Henry Ford had asked his customers what they wanted, it would have been a faster horse. So he didn't believe much in consumer research.
Let's talk a bit more about this notion of successful communities and how they create an environment. Heidi, can you talk a little bit more about your experience that way?
Sure, and there's kind of a two-part question here, and I think I have an assignment for folks here on the second part of the question. When people define success very differently, of course, but I think a lot of times people are thinking about it's a healthy place to live, it's a safe place, it's multi-generational, it has, all of the goods and services, it has all of the amenities we're looking for, but then there's that, what else? What is the there that makes your place distinctive and special from other communities? And when I work around the United States, what those communities that kind of rise up as really the most vibrant are really the ones with the strongest leadership all the way around, and that includes, community leadership. So when I'm working in a suburb of Chicago or a suburb here even, it's the places that tend to be more successful in terms of those vibrant, just vibrant spaces and communities. As you've got the major employers, you've got your school district, you have your city, your civic groups, your local philanthropists, your anchoring institutions, your church leaders, all of that leadership on all levels in your community really talking to each other and working together, and that really comes from the ground up. It comes from strong neighborhoods and strong participation by citizens of the community. When I work in bigger urban markets, you can tell when the leadership's on the same page and when they're not. I work for a nonprofit, so we work a lot with places like the Ford Foundation and the Kresge Foundation, who are looking at making investments in our urban cores and trying to help with our urban core issues. And that's always what they're looking for is, where's the leadership? Where's the major employers here sitting down with your local officials and talking about what they're hearing when they're trying to hire people to work in Shoreview? What are they looking for? And does that exist here? And of course, you've got your fantastic school district. And so, how do you build on the strength of that over all those sectors, including alternate types of retail space, like we've discussed, alternate types of transportation, being really innovative and forward-thinking. And it doesn't always involve, big change. I heard the real concern about what does redevelopment mean, and it doesn't always have to mean, bulldozers and plowing down neighborhoods. In fact, I think that's a huge mistake with the scarce resources and how are we going to pay for our crumbling roads and infrastructures. I think both governments and the development community need to look really carefully at how we're deploying those resources in the best way to make a good community even better. And so the second part of Gordon's question was, how do successful cities engage residents in the development process? And a major way to do that is just by the conversation that we're having tonight. And I would encourage you through this comprehensive planning process to continue to have those backyard neighborhood gatherings where you're talking about what's important to Shoreview and your quality of life. One great example of this, I don't know if you know the artist Candy Chang or have seen her work around the United States, but she puts up these giant chalkboard murals in communities, and there's a sentence that says, before I die, I wish I blank, and you fill in the blank. So a lot of community meetings I've seen taking that theme and whether it's with sticky notes or pieces of paper on your table, you all seem to have papers and pens. I would encourage you to tear off a sheet of paper and leave it with the folks from the city that are here tonight that says, I wish Shoreview had blank, or this is an important issue to me, and write it down on a piece of paper. We've heard there's 40-some of you in the room tonight, and I bet we can get some trends. We've talked about transportation a lot, but what other things come to mind? When I work in, when I do these kinds of meetings that are even more interactive, the sticky notes on the wall say everything from very simple things like, I'd love a Saturday farmer's market, I'd love more unpaved trails, I'd love to see an outdoor concert series, to more difficult things like, I'd love to see more investment in studying how we're going to age in place and how are we going to take care of our seniors. And so a wide variety of from the simple to the complex topics, and the more you talk about those, and the more that your leadership, not just at the government level, but those other leaders we're talking about in your school districts and your business leaders, the more they hear that, the more you kind of start getting everybody on the same page about where you want to go as a community.
So I was just, thinking a little bit in terms of, the question was raised about redevelopment. I don't know anything about the 14-page Wazoo Colgrove plan. I just want to caveat this by saying that I'm going to start touching the redevelopment discussion, but, I think it is true that as a, predominantly fully developed community, a lot of this change and a lot of the change that's going to happen and your ability or desire to want to respond to that is going to be driven through redevelopment. And, I think identifying the appropriate places, engaging with the citizens, those are all things that the successful communities do in order to make redevelopment successful, right? So, St. Louis Park is a great example. We kind of look back, and it's a community that we work with, and we were kind of looking the other day, and they've engaged in about $1 billion worth of housing development projects that they've participated financially in the last, I'll say, 10 years or something like that. It's a phenomenal amount of that's all redevelopment, right? So and it's come with, as we've noted, a lot of neighborhood concern and reshaping of some of these plans, but none of that investment is going to happen. And the folks that have to stand up here and actually go to the bank and put up their own equity, when they walk into a community, they want to know that that community has sat down, thought about what it wants to be, knows where those areas in its communities are that are opportunities to deliver that, and welcome them in so that they don't want to go bang their head against the wall with communities that don't want them there. So I think, to expect that, we can draw plans out and we can show things on paper, but nothing's going to happen unless I think a lot of neighborhoods and a lot of the communities and a lot of the leadership in the community wants it to happen. And we work in places where, we do a lot of matchmaking between developers and communities because we kind of know what the community's goals are. We know what a lot of the developers that are out there like to do and what their niche is. And, we've seen it go both ways. We've seen communities that don't have a good handle on what it is their residents want, have a site and say, okay, we want to plunk this down. And they haven't had a lot of engagement that's gone on. And we've seen neighbors, yourselves, come to these meetings and say, hey, wait a minute, nobody asked us what it is we want. This isn't how we want this to go. And we've seen a lot of councils and planning commissions kind of back out and say, you know what? Wow, we had no idea. They're not necessarily always there to, ram a project through. And so they do listen when that happens. And that's a bad scenario for attracting investment in your community because in those cases, those developers that we brought to the table have all kind of said, you know what, we're gonna back off. We want to let you solve whatever issues that is you have. We're going to take our investment over here instead because we're just not comfortable. So there's a reality that is attached to knowing what it is you want out there as a community. We've seen it go the other way, where we've had communities work hard through neighborhood processes, identify a specific location, and say, you know what, this is an opportunity for us. These are the kind of things that we want to see here that are going to be in our community, and now we want you to go out and help find us a partner. And those processes are the ones that are enjoyable to work on because you find somebody that actually fits that mold, right? Comes in, and you've got a community that's already ready for those folks, and everybody's happy, and it's a win-win kind of a deal. So I think ideally, in terms of being a successful community redevelopment, that's the standard we're all working towards. Obviously, there's always a spectrum somewhere in between all there. It's never quite perfect.
Yeah, I'd like to just amplify that. As a developer and an investor, we absolutely won't go into a community where there's not clarity about. There are plenty of things that we don't know when we start a project. You don't know what the subsoil conditions are. You don't know what the environmental conditions are. You don't know where the capital markets are going. You don't know so many things that, and we've learned this the hard way. We've lost hundreds of thousands of dollars by spending time in communities where staff and the community and the policymakers all, were either just hadn't done their work yet or had different dreams. And so that's really a critical thing. I think the very first question we have tonight is the most important one, and that is, this is a successful community. And to the extent that you can really be clear about what it is that makes this community successful. What is it about this place? And it's powerful. And if you can be clear about that, that will really help everybody as you move forward, because this place shouldn't be like downtown Minneapolis or St. Paul. It shouldn't be like Ridgefield. It should be Shoreview. And it should consider how it knits in with the other communities around it, from an infrastructure standpoint, from a transportation standpoint, and just in terms of lifestyle and what it is that you really want to cultivate here.
Just want to add one thing to that. The city's embarking on its comprehensive planning process, and as you start thinking about that and the influences that we've all talked about today, what we see a lot of times is a lot of communities feel like, well, if we can just kind of maintain the status quo, then that's what we want. But, and John alluded to this, is that, doing that is that there's still change that's going to happen, right? You might have 35-year-old families with young children going to the schools today, but in 20 years, they're 55, they're empty nesters, and guess what? They may not want to leave their home. So if that happens, like on a community-wide basis, it changes the nature of, the kind of amenities that this community is going to want and need and be provided with, right, from a retail standpoint, because now, John's going to run his retail demographics and say, geez, there's not a lot of young folks here, they're not going to spend their money on maybe going out to eat, this and that, but these are the kind of services now that we might have. And so, as you start thinking about, the kind of amenities that you want in your community, the kind of, I know restaurants are kind of a big deal. You also have to think about the kind of population that you're going to cultivate, right? That's going to be able to spend the money and frequent those establishments. That's going to continue to support that. So I just know that we run into a lot of this that says if we just kind of can keep our community just the way it is, everything's going to be great. But I can tell you, if you do that and you wake up 20 years from now, you're not going to be in the same place. So it's just something to keep in mind as you're playing.
No decision is a decision.
Yeah.
It is.
In itself. Other questions before we, yeah, right here.
Well, I had not so much questions, but more, I guess, comments back to the city as things go on. And it's a lot of what's been taken from questions throughout. So we just recently built a house, we did it 2 months ago. It was a huge process ordeal. Actually, it continues to be. But I watched my neighbor, and there's the Metro Mobility van that shows up there 4 to 6 times a day, because it's 4 people living in a group home, and multiple times a day. So the city truly needs something to get people to doctor's appointments, to different things, because it's not cost effective for anybody to have Metro Mobility showing up there 6 times a day at one house. I mean,
And they're not very reliable either.
no, they're not,
Very
not
early or
at all.
very late.
So, I mean, that's just one thing. But then my other thing is, it would, as things move forward, because change is inevitable, and healthcare is changing at such a rapid pace right now, it's crazy. And I know that change will come. But the biggest thing is for the city and for everybody to be open and honest with us as things are coming and changes are coming. I mean, I looked on the city website, and I thought I was looking at something about the community center expansion and development, and I thought, this is great. Until I actually click on the bottom picture, and I blow it up, and I see, oh, this redevelopment for a parking lot and like apartment buildings is right on top of people's homes. Like, I never picked up on that until I blew up the picture. And so if the city is just open with the community, I think that's kind of what we all want. It's just open communication with what's coming.
I'm going to have Catherine respond, and then I'll get to you.
Yeah, I was actually going to respond just with a plug for one of your own community members who I just met pretty recently in response to your first question, is developing what is essentially a car sharing platform for people who have mobility needs. And I think that's really exciting, and it's great to hear, and I'll have to pass your comment back to him because, yeah, there are people with disabilities, there are people who are aging, people who broke their leg, all sorts of, instances happen in all of our lives where solving that last mile question, how do I get to the doctor, how do I get to the grocery store? And so hopefully there's going to be some improvement coming from one of your own community members. I just wanted to put in a plug for that.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm just curious if there are any people from the planning commission here this evening. Is this a conversation that's also happening with the planning commission?
We take, there's a lot of things I could comment about, but yes, we have our monthly planning commission meeting. We're meeting twice a month now. It's a special workshop to go over the comprehensive plan in different sections. Kathleen is going to talk more about that, but so we're taking input seriously. This forum, this is televised. Some of the commissioners that aren't here, you have the ability to watch this, and the notes actually get circulated discussion. But it's an interesting panel. I've been to every one of these events and welcome input from the community. And I applaud everyone here that's here today. And I don't think we have all the answers when you think about it. That's one of the reasons we have things like this and we're soliciting input. There's been a lot of times in the planning commission when we don't get input and we're looking for it. And so we have to make a decision. Go ahead.
Are they open to the public, the meetings, the planning commission meetings?
The planning commission meetings are open to the public. The workshops, I believe, are they open? It's just that you can't have a dialogue at the workshops.
But you can listen.
You can listen, yes.
But there's not a way to share input at the meetings? Or like a question?
I don't certainly comment, but I think that's getting away from tonight's topic. I'd certainly welcome a conversation with you afterwards. And actually, I was going to kind of review this when we closed out the meeting tonight, so I don't know if you have any more questions that you want to answer. As far as our comprehensive plan process, we are currently really what I would call in the very early stages of our process. As Commissioner Solomonson had indicated, yes, the Planning Commission has had a few workshops to discuss the comprehensive plan, but no decisions have been made with respect to any land use policies, any policies related to transportation, housing, parks, etc. So we are at the very early stages of this. And the intent of our process and to have these conversations is really to gain this feedback at the beginning of the process. So when we do finalize our draft plan, the Planning Commission and other leaders in the community can take into consideration the comments that were received. For that reason, we are videotaping it tonight because I know there are members who can't attend, whether or not they're a member of a Planning Commission, another committee, or even just members of the general public. So those videos will be posted online, and people will certainly have the opportunity to provide us feedback. Just to review, I'll just review a little bit of our schedule. So this is our second community conversation, and this is really our first conversation where we're diving into one of the key topics of the comprehensive plan, which is land use and development. And with the feedback that we gained here tonight, we'll be taking that information back to the Planning Commission and working on our land use chapter. Our next session is September 21st, so I again encourage you to come, and that will focus on economic development, and we have two speakers, Jonathan Weinhagen, who is a Shoreview resident who's with Minneapolis Chamber of Commerce, and then Heather Worthington, who is a deputy commissioner with Ramsey County. And October 12th, we'll focus on housing and neighborhoods, and November 9th, natural resources and resiliency. But just in terms of the work schedule, again, we've just begun this process. So we just, as staff, began working on the comprehensive plan in June. And we are continuing to work with a number of our advisory groups. The Planning Commission is one of them, but we do have other advisory groups that will be involved, such as our Environmental Quality Committee, Parks and Recreation Committee, Bike and Trailways, and there are actually members of other groups here tonight.
We anticipate that the draft plan would be completed in April of 2018, and that will be the entire plan. And that will be brought out to the public for informal comment and review in May or June. And then we would move into the formal comment period where the Planning Commission holds a public hearing to review the plan, and the City Council would take action on it in December. So it is a lengthy process. You know, tonight where the plan stands, we do not have any policies drafted or developed in terms of, you know, what may be happening near or in your neighborhood. Yes, there was a document that the resident is referring to, which was a study that the city completed a few years ago that did take a look at some of our neighborhoods along some of the roadway corridors in the city, and where we wanted to explore further because of the impact increased transportation has on those corridors, and in some instances, land use transitions were already occurring. So we were concerned how that would impact our residential neighborhoods, and if there's anything we could be proactive in terms of long-range planning on how to address changes that are occurring in those areas. So that's the work schedule, and I guess just what I would say is certainly reach out to me if you do have questions throughout this process. I may not be able to answer them specifically at this point in time just because we're not all that far along in the process, but I also encourage you, you know, we talked about feedback and way of getting the community engaged. If you do go to the Shoreview website, destination.shoreviewmn.gov, there's actually a number of tools on that website that you can use to provide feedback, and so I would certainly encourage you to do so. And that website is ever changing. As we get more information, we're posting information up there. So when we do have a draft of our land use chapter completed, that will certainly be posted, and there would be the opportunity to provide comments on that. So I just wanted to refer you all to that resource because it's a great tool for you to be involved for residents, whether they're here or not at the meeting. So with that, I would like to thank our panelists tonight. There's a few questions in the back. Yep.
And I'm certainly not trying to hijack any meeting space. It was simply that I was told by somebody who's newly moved off of the Planning Commission, he had been on it for a number of years, that it's during the Planning Commission stages that we need to weigh in on input. Once a recommendation goes to City Council, it's too late. So that's why I'm concerned, and that's why I'm asking these questions today.
Okay, thank you.
And the answer is what?
Again, we have not developed any land use policies yet with that Planning Commission. I expect we will sometime this fall, and if there are changes proposed for land use in your area, you will be notified as an affected property owner, and then we will be holding open houses with you to discuss those proposed policy changes.
Isn't there any vote that the City of Shoreview can take as residents to any of this? I mean,
your opportunity to participate is through these conversations, through the open houses that we'll be holding, through the informal comment period that we'll have next year, as far as, and then the formal comment period begins with the Planning Commission at a public hearing, which would be in the fall of 2018.
Is that before or after the recommendation to the City Council?
This is before the recommendation to the City Council.
Okay.
Did you disagree what? If you disagree what? What as a resident, if you disagree, can you do?
You can voice your opinion.
Which means what?
You can participate
Like
in
the Kozlak property, it meant nothing. So is that going to be the same thing?
No. Okay. So our process, I think our Planning Commission and our City Council do very well in engaging our community in the review process. And they do listen to comments. They do take those comments into consideration when making a decision on an application. You know, I know not everyone agrees with maybe the development that's being proposed, the impacts it can have on your property. But I can tell you that those are considered in the decision-making process. Okay.
Thank you.
Well, I appreciate it, and I appreciate you all getting out tonight. And I certainly do encourage you to stay involved, whether it be via the website, reaching out to staff, or coming to these community